acknowledge my co-author here from the beginning, Joachim Wiersma. So we put this list together and specially consult on the picks, or kind of our recommended list of varieties that we'll see at the end of the presentation. So this is our new combine on the St. Paul campus. The Ag Experiment Station purchased that last year. We rent it basically for $200 an hour. Use it for about a week on campus. It's used for some other crops on campus too. So that's our first new combine on campus, used for wheat since the 1980s. So we were due for an update. It's got an onboard weighing system, so we get the yield data essentially immediately, moisture adjusted, so that helps with our timeliness of getting data in and getting analysis out. There we go. All right, so first just talk about our recent variety releases and where they're at acreage-wise. So Linkard is still hanging in there a little bit. Torgy was the #1 variety in the state of Minnesota in 2022. It fell to second place in 2023, but still a pretty good acreage. And MN Rothsay, our 2022 release, has certified seed available for this year, so I'm expecting a pretty big bump up in its acreage for 2024. So here are the top 8 varieties based on acreage for the last 3 years. So this is something that I pay a lot of attention to. Thank the wheat growers for sending out the survey and getting this information. It helps kind of calibrate our breeding program, knowing what growers are looking for in varieties, what's popular, and what we think may be in need of replacement, or what vulnerabilities varieties have, and we can target replacements to go after those varieties. So last year, 9590 was #1. It's been steadily climbing up. Torgy took a little bit of a dip down. Valda's still hanging in there. 9479 still hanging in there. But again, Rothsay is the one that I expect to take a pretty big jump by 2024. And I'll have all of these guys on a slide near the end that compares their characteristics, and I'll point out some particular strengths and weaknesses of those varieties as I see them. Only 4 new varieties in our testing this year. Usually this list is about 7 or 8. So a little dip. I don't know if this is a 1-year phenomenon, but not too much new that we tested this last year. Braun SD, we actually tested that as an experimental the year before, so we have 2 years of data on that one. 1 new cropland variety, LCS Boom from Lima Grain, and TCG said Teddy from 21st Century Genetics. All right, so right into some data. All my slides are going to be presented in this type of format, where all of the name varieties that we tested are on these slides. The best for the trait, and so I'm going to show yield, protein, some diseases, pre-harvest sprouting, and straw strength. So the best ones are always in the upper left-hand corner, and the worst ones are in the lower right-hand corner. All of the new varieties from 2022 and 2023 are highlighted in bold. So if you're looking for new varieties, those are the newest ones. Seed may or may not be available because they may be too new yet. Probably not widely available for the 2023s, but you should have seed availability for 2022 releases. So this is yield, northern locations, 3-year averages. And I basically do a sort on the 3-year average where we have them, where we only have 2 or 3 years. I kind of just sort them in there based how they fall out. So the newer varieties, we have a couple of newer ones that are in that top yield group, but a lot of a lot of in the lower yield group tend to be a little higher protein varieties. Quite a dramatic range here. I'm still amazed that Linkard is holding in there as well as it has, because it's been at or near the bottom of all of these varieties, at least in our small plot testing program for many years. So it had a good year, good 5-year run as the #1 variety in the state. But it's probably got some guys that are ready to replace it and have replaced it in many respects. Next, talk about protein. Huge range of protein. We don't test bulls anymore because the acreage in Minnesota has pretty well disappeared. So bulls would always be the highest in protein here. Now we've got the West bred variety up near the top there. None of the newer varieties really high in protein. The newer ones tend to be a little bit lower. I'll try to point out Rasse here when I remember to. Rasse I would characterize as a medium protein variety. 14% in our hands. So that means on a typical grower field, you're probably going to be maybe a 0.5 percentage point less than what we see in our replicated yield trial testing system. I've also got baking quality next to it. 1 is good or the best. 9 would be the worst. We like to see things basically 5 or better. We think those would be, acceptable in our export market and for domestic use. But the 1s, 2s, 3s, those would be the best ones, the ones that are in highest demand. So overall, I think as a state, we're doing pretty good in producing higher quality wheats, and we actually have been for some time. So we want to try to keep that trend going as much as possible. And the next slide, when it comes up, should be yield versus protein. There we go. It's always a little bit depressing for me to put this up, maybe for you two. This line seems like it's pretty darn steep. If I put a line through those points, the correlation is negative 0.87. So it's getting to be a pretty near perfect negative correlation between yield and protein. And of course, what we would like to have is breeders and growers or varieties out here that yield and produce protein. But what happens is there's always something that's pushing the yield farther and farther out, and invariably these are the lowest protein varieties. Ballistic is kind of pushing into that higher protein, higher yield area. I've highlighted in red some of the recent Minnesota releases. Not every variety's on here. There's too many, and it was just getting too bunched up. The print is probably too small for a lot of you to read as is, but just want to continually point out that very negative correlation between yield and protein. So when you see our data, these high yield ones are really attractive because they've got some fantastic numbers, but look at the other characteristics as well and think about what sort of protein discount you may be running into. The other kind of notable feature from the last couple of years, and it's not just the last couple of years, but the trend seems to be stronger, or at least I'm seeing it more clearly, is that these highest yielding varieties are also pretty late heading and late maturity, to the point where I think for most guys it's too late. You're just not going to grow them. So if we draw a line at 92 bushel per acre, anything yielding above that line, so now I've got yield on the y-axis, heading date, or days to heading from planting on the x-axis, anything over 92 bushel per acre average, so some of the highest yielding stuff, they're pretty late. So compare it to some other varieties. So many of you are familiar with Torgi, Valda. They're already pushing on the late side, I think, and probably later than some guys would like to be. So these higher yielding ones are even later than that, and they all tend to be fairly low protein as well. The red ones here, these are the most popular varieties. So these are the 8 most popular varieties in the state. None of them are these really late ones. Rasse heads a little bit later than Torgi, but in most locations, most situations would mature a little bit earlier. Torgi seems to hang on and stay green a little bit longer. So we're pushing more. We're trying to find earlier heading, earlier maturing lines. There does seem to be a little bit of a yield penalty with them, but we know that's something that is in demand out there. So we're trying to favor those as we look for new varieties to release. Straw strength, we range 2 to a 6, so there's nothing, no 7s, 8s, 9s in here. AP Smith, so AgriPro and Linkert are the only ones that are rated as a 2. These 3s in most years you won't see a difference. They'll stand just as well. They'll be perfectly fine. Anytime I've got a decimal in here, that means we need a little bit more testing. So we'll classify it as a 3 or 4 eventually. And I've been thinking about just adding decimal places to all these anyway to better differentiate. So something like Torgi is really maybe like a 4.4. It's tending towards a 5. And something like Rasse would be maybe like a 2.5. So there's a big difference in straw strength between Rasse and Torgi, even though when you average it and round it off, it's only a 1 point difference. And I think your experience would probably tell you the same thing if you've grown some of these varieties. So 2s and 3s are going to be fine, probably most years. 4s or 5s are kind of what we consider classical hard red spring straw strength. 6s would be fairly weak, and most situations you're probably going to experience some lodging. But if you want a lot of straw, those tend to be some of the taller varieties. Scab. Haven't seen much scab the last few years. We've been drier, but it's a disease we don't want to forget about. The fungicides, yes, they're better, but the timing is still fairly critical, and you have to be able to get your spray rigs out there or get an airplane hired if you do need to put that preventive treatment on. So almost half the varieties are 3s or 4s. We would consider those moderately resistant. So as an industry, I think the breeders and companies and the publics have done a pretty good job of providing some good options here that are moderately resistant. Rasse is a 4, but there's still a number. Once you get in the 6 area, we've got some vulnerability there, and there's some pretty popular varieties. So the 2 West spreads, they're 7s. We've always had them rated as a 7. Murdoch is a 7. Wildcat, also a 7. So I've been encouraging growers for years, try to find something on the left-hand side that could maybe substitute and give us a little less vulnerability to this disease, because I don't think anybody's forgotten how bad it can be when we have epidemic conditions. We just haven't seen it the last few years. Another disease we've been putting a lot of emphasis on, mostly because you really have no other options. There's no crop rotations, cultural control, nothing you can spray to really do anything about bacterial leaf streak. And as this photo shows, it can just fire the leaves within just a few days. You can go from green leaves to pretty brown. The disease likes higher temperatures, higher humidity conditions. This last year we didn't see too much of it. 2022 a little bit. 2021 there was none anywhere because we were in pretty severe drought. So we don't have ratings on all of the newer varieties, but where we do have ratings, there's a pretty big range. A 2 means I've never seen significant damage. Yes, there's going to be a lesion or 2, but it doesn't seem to spread. Those varieties hold up really well. The threes also pretty good. These Gunsmoke is an 8. These other ones that are 6s, depending on the environment, and the environment has a lot to do with that, and the timing, those can really fire up and give you some problems. And tan spot and septoria, so these are leaf diseases that can be controlled by fungicide. I think most of you are putting on fungicide with your herbicide, 3 to 5 leaf stage. That'll kind of tamp it down. But in the last couple of years, I've been getting some pretty good ratings on this complex of diseases. In the cases where I can differentiate it from bacterial leaf streak, it can be difficult. The bacteria is more elongated lesions. These tend to be a little bit more elliptical. If they're together, it would take me hours to rate a trial, so I'll maybe just do a combined rating. But if I see just one of these types, either bacteria or tan spot or septoria, I'll give them a rating. And there's pretty big differences there too. So Rothsay is actually one of the better ones, quite resistant, probably should not need a fungicide, at least at that later flag leaf stage. But we've got some 6s and 7s that we need to be concerned about and diligent with. And if you start seeing these symptoms and you want to keep that flag leaf clean, this is, some of these varieties could probably benefit from a fungicide treatment. Pre-harvest sprouting. So if you remember 2019, that's when we got hit with the low falling numbers. It wasn't necessarily a sprouting issue. It was low alpha amylase activity that was caused by low temperatures near harvest maturity. That correlates fairly well with pre-harvest sprouting, but you can still get low falling numbers even if you don't see any sprouting. There's a correlation there, but just because we have a lot of 1s doesn't mean that those varieties could not also give you a low falling number if you have the right environmental conditions. So there's a separate genetic mechanism that can also give you the low falling numbers. We have some idea of what those varieties are, the problematic ones. A lot of the really bad ones historically are not grown anymore. If you remember the variety Granite had low falling numbers. There's a couple others that were basically blackballed, and they're no longer in the region. So I feel pretty good about the number of 1s and 2s that we've got. So those are pretty good resistance to pre-harvest sprouting. But I do get a little bit concerned that we do have a fair number of 4s and even a 5 in there. So the way we do this test, we harvest at physiological maturity, dry them down, throw them in the freezer to when we get around to testing them, take intact spikes, put them in a dew chamber, so perfect conditions to germinate. And the 1s, they will not germinate at all after 7 days. You won't see anything. Something that's a 5, you'll see probably 5 or 6 big coleoptiles and roots. Half the seed on that spike had germinated and started to grow. So these are some pretty dramatic differences. And that's why we don't grow white wheats here. The genetic control, the 3 genes that give you red kernel color also give you pretty good resistance to pre-harvest sprouting. White wheats as a whole are pretty susceptible to pre-harvest sprouting. That's why the white wheats are grown in western Kansas, Colorado, western North Dakota to some extent. So much drier climates where they don't have to worry about sprouting. All right, finally, the picks. So here's the criteria. So trying to be as objective as possible. So it's got to be something that we've tested for at least 3 years. So we know it fairly well. We know what it can do. We've rated all the diseases. It has to be a 5 or less for FHB and BLS. So that would be kind of a moderate, resistant, moderate, susceptible sort of situation. less than or equal to a 3 for pre-harvest sprouting, and less than or equal to a 6, or better than or equal to a 6 for quality. So this is not a really high bar for any of these, but I would say they're kind of minimums. So if you apply that to all 40-some varieties, this is the list that you get. And what I've done with this list is I've sorted them by their 20 to 23 northern location yield, so three years worth of yield. So the top yielding variety from this group is actually Rasse. So it's the top yielder among this group. It's strong, only minus, and it still makes the criteria, but it's not the best for quality. I would say it's just average for quality, kind of average gluten strength, bread making volume. But for a state like Minnesota to grow 25% of the acres of this, as long as it gets mixed in with something that's a good protein, good gluten strength, I think that's going to be just fine. It's not going to hurt our export market. Ballistic, quite a few negatives here, just kind of sneaking through on some of these. A 5 for lodging. Valda, fairly well. Little bit weak straw. Driver, actually, I think Driver, we changed the lodging score on that. It's now rounded to a 4, so it's a little bit better. Ambush, this Syngenta 611 CL2, that's a clear field wheat. I don't think it's probably not hardly any acreage in Minnesota, so that you would get sold clear field herbicide to go along with that. That one's just making it for quality. CP 3530, we've tested this for a number of years. It's pretty good for scab. It's fairly tall, so if you want straw, this is one of the taller varieties, but it's also a little more susceptible to lodging. Cannon always looks good because it's early, but it's not as good a yielding as some of these other ones. I think we got a little bit of a yield penalty for that earliness. And Torgi also makes the list, and I'll say it's balanced. It's got kind of a nice balance of yield and protein. So that's the picks. And the last data slide I'll show is comparing Rasse with those other 7 most popular varieties. So this is kind of the Cliff's Notes of the entire talk, so to speak. So we've got a lot of traits on here. Green is good, red is bad. So a variety like Rasse, we don't see any traits that are in the red. Quality is in the orange, it's a 5, so probably it's worst characteristics. I've said this before, if I could change one thing on Rasse, if I could make it a day or 2 earlier, maturity, heading and maturity, and still have that yield, I think that would be a good thing to have. The other thing that I'll point out here, pre-harvest sprouting. All of the top 8 varieties are 1s and 2s. So that's good. We're not growing any 4s or 5s. So as a state, I can sleep well at night knowing we should not have any major pre-harvest sprouting issues if we get a lot of dew or rains in mid-August when we're trying to harvest. This is the one, this is probably the trait that bothers me the most, is Fusarium head blight. Seeing those 7s there, and they tend to be in some of the higher acreage varieties such as 9590, 9479, and the acreage of Murdoch that we've got as well. So continue to encourage growers to kind of switch out of those varieties if possible. I think there are some good choices where you could at least get to a 4 or a 5 and have a little less vulnerability with that disease. So I'll finish by acknowledging our collaborators. So this is kind of the research team for 2023. Not part of the research team technically, but Minnesota Crop Improvement is a good collaborator with us. They're responsible for seed increases, help with advertising of varieties. And I just want to acknowledge the retirement of Roger Whippler. So he retired about a month ago. So I know most of you would know Roger, and Carl Anfinson, his replacement, is here in the audience. So he's got a booth out there, so get to know Carl. He's Roger's replacement, essentially. And finally, I will show our funding sources. So Wheat Research and Promotion Council is, about a third to between a quarter and a third of our total funding for the program. And then we've got U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative is a big chunk, and also state sources. So I'll stop there and take any questions you've got on wheat varieties or our breeding program. Maybe I can head off one popular question is, what do you got coming next? We do not have anything on increase right now. Frankly, it's been tough to find something that will outdo Torgy or Rasse. When I look at that, those traits and performance, yield is actually a big one. It's very difficult to beat Rasse for yield in our testing program. We've got a few that we're kind of moving along, hoping maybe they'll be a little better next year or the year after. But I've been throwing away a lot of stuff just because they can't beat Torgy or Rasse. So that's kind of the bar that we're trying to get over right now. So we won't have a 2024 release. There won't be a 2025 release. Next possible one, if we send something for a winter increase next year, would be a 2026 release. So I'm hoping that Torgy and Rasse have nice long runs, so there's some U of M germplasm out there.
Great presentation, Jim. Question for you. It's interesting how late some of these varieties are getting. Have you noticed any impacts on test weight?
Yes, some of those later varieties are quite low in test weight. We've seen some test weights in the 50s from some of these guys. So yeah, some of those I think companies are putting them in just kind of speculative to see how they're going to do, and some of them are kind of bombing pretty good. So I don't think they're going to sell any seed. And some of them, we'll test them for 1 year and we don't get them back the next year because they perform so badly. So some of those, the really later ones, yeah, I expect we're not going to see them tested again next year because of yield or not yield, test weight and protein are, I would say, unacceptably low, plus the lateness.
Any other questions for Jim? We had a quiet crowd this morning. I know a couple of years back, I don't know, when we had a wet season, Torgy seemed to stay a little green. Have you guys pretty much seen kind of that stay green kind of problem resolve itself, or was that just like a 1-year fluke?
No, Torgy's a weird one. I don't know what it's going to look like from one location or 1 year to another. It seems to have sort of a plasticity in how green it stays, how late it goes in maturing. And I don't remember that as it was going through its kind of seed increase phase in early testing, but the last 2 years especially, I've seen it get like way taller than I've ever seen it before. And like, is this really Torgy? Did we get something mixed up in the seed? And you could go from one location to another. Like St. Paul, it might be knee high. Crookston, it might be up here. So I think just some the weather patterns the last 2 years, we've been kind of later planting too. Probably some of the later planting dates we've had were in 2022 and 2023. So I think it's really pretty sensitive to planting date and what the conditions are.
Thanks for the update, Jim. My question is about bacterial leaf streak. We're seeing that occurring more often in the last 2 years or so. Um, in terms of the efforts, like breeding efforts in your breeding program for bacterial leaf streak and the variation in the germplasm for bacterial leaf streak and its impact on yield in the grower's field, can you comment a little bit more about that disease and looking forward, what should we be planning?
Yeah, so bacterial leaf streak is something, I guess it first kind of caught our radar in about 2005. And when we first started seeing it, it was more on the ends of the plots. And then 2011, I remember distinctly, grower field near Stephen, Minnesota, it was everywhere. It was in the plots. And since then, it seems to be fairly ubiquitous. And if we have the right humidity, temperature, moisture conditions, so you need all of those, you can readily find it out there. And there's big variety differences. We don't think there's any particular race structure with the pathogen. It's just kind of a general resistance or susceptibility to the whole population. I don't know, you could call it maybe a climate change disease, that we're getting higher humidity, higher nighttime temperatures. That's probably all contributing. We see enough natural infection most years in our yield plots that we can score it, get rid of the real susceptibles. But Ruth Dilmacki and her project has got a good screening technique now, where she's inoculating bacteria on some of our advanced lines and adding mist into those systems to get reliable infection. So we're starting to use those more heavily to help rate varieties and try to get rid of the real susceptibles. So if there's anything that's a 6 or worse, we would probably not release it as a variety. So for us, it would have to be a 5 or better in order to release it. And and I think other breeders are doing something like that too, because once you see it in a yield plot or even in a single row early generation, if it's real susceptible, you're probably going to chuck it out pretty quick, because it's so obvious when there's something that's really susceptible. So hopefully there's not too many highly susceptibles getting to the variety release stage anymore.
Yes, I'm wondering, what are the saved seed restrictions on the Minnesota varieties?
The seed restrictions so all of the Minnesota varieties are have plant variety protection. So that means that the variety has to be marketed by name, and all of our varieties are going through Crop Improvement Association for seed increase. So they have to advertise it by name, and they're authorized to sell that variety. Occasionally we'll have a variety that gets licensed, but that's a pretty rare situation. So right now we're still doing mostly public releases, especially for the varieties that are the most popular. And just plant variety protection, no patenting, no certified seed, so you can save seed for replanting on your own farm. There's no restriction on that.